This is the debrief for the March 19, 2022 annual meeting of the electors. And these were for the salary resolutions where people that show up in the meeting, the electors, can override the board on their own salaries. And I had these drawn up this way, and the board had voted on this beforehand, but it also puts it through to the electors for the salaries to stay the same for the elected officials. There was a movement at the meeting and a motion made and supported, and we had a vote on it, for the supervisor, clerk, and treasurer to go from $43K a year, which is what we're at now, to $50K a year, and for the trustees to go from $5,000 a year, which is what they're at now, to $7,000 a year. That one was voted down, and then the motion was made to keep them the same, and we voted on them separately, and those went through, and so the salaries stayed the same. Which starts the debate, which happened at the meeting, which I think is good. It's the idea of deliberative democracy, and we have it to a limited extent in the United States, and probably more than in other countries, most countries, and I think that's good, but this deliberation, this discussion over these issues, I think is good. And that happened at the meeting some, and I got messages after the meeting and a few questions about why not raise the salaries of the officials. And this has been a debate ever since the start of the United States, which I'm sure most people probably don't realize. Benjamin Franklin proposed in the Constitutional Convention debates, you can read Madison's notes on it, of having no salaries for the elected positions. When he was making the proposal, he stated that he wasn't even sure if it was a good idea or not, but he thought it should be discussed and is a reasonable proposal. And then obviously that didn't go through, and our politicians do get paid. The idea of high-paid politicians, to me, it's a bad idea that I have personally. I have a bad feeling towards it. I don't think it's right. But there's a lot of other issues, and I don't think the strongest debates were made there. The strongest argument, the only real argument in the meeting put forward for it, is that it should be more, because the politicians should be getting more. The elected officials at this level should be getting more. In comparison to other politicians in the area, $43,000 a year isn't. And I haven't done a strong comparison on those numbers. I don't know if that's a great way to do it in the outline area. I know that in Fruitland, directly next to us, they make $36,000 a year, so they make $7,000 a year less than the elected officials here for the three main positions. I'm not sure about trustees, and so that comparison could go in that way. We have these other local places. I mean, Blue Lake, Holton, they're small population. Cedar Creek, so I don't know what they make, but I know it's not going to be much. I think out in Holton they might make like $20,000 a year for the supervisor, but it's also more part-time. And then you can compare it to the county. You can even do comparisons to like a living wage, something like that. But if you look at my role of managing, right, it's a managership position, and you take the living wage calculation for Muskegon County from the university, MIT, it's $106,000 a year, which is a lot, and each dollar that goes towards official salaries doesn't go towards something else. It's always a trade-off. And so I don't even think the greatest proposals were put in place, though, because they don't apply in this case. So if you take Franklin's idea of the elected officials not having pay in those positions, I like that idea, but it excludes a lot of people. It would exclude me from taking the position. I can't go without any pay for 4 years. And so what you can end up with is only people that can afford this. So only the wealthier class, the higher socioeconomic class, can be in the political roles, which I don't think is necessarily ideal either. Or you could have had some sort of organizations grow up where a private organization funds a politician while they're in office, and now you have influence there that's not ideal. And we already have a huge lobbying system, and so that's not good, and goes into the history of our tax system, early 1900s, destruction of the Constitution with the 16th and 17th Amendments and stuff like that, right? Which is all very interesting. You also have the argument that you could attract higher quality people if you were at higher pay. And the point on that is like, are you sure? Because you might be able to attract people with higher technical skills, because now they're looking at it as a career. And so now you're making the case that the township elected officials are really just part of the administrative state. And so at that point, why are you really electing them? They're just here to do a function that's really laid out by state law. And we have a ton of that, right? And the state allows these more local municipalities to do certain things, and that's a theory that the states created the Fed, and so they should have more power than that. And I like that, and I think that should be there, not really in effect now. And then the state also created these lower municipalities, and that is okay. I think it would be better from the ground up, but you'd have to do a different system, and we've moved away from that, right? The 17th Amendment even destroyed that between the states and the feds, which collapses the idea of federalism that the United States was founded upon and should slowly lead to the death of the system, which is what we're experiencing now. Anyway, it's still, there's a lot of good qualities. Some people, they see those types of things, and usually they don't even see those things. They just have a general feeling that things are bad in some way, which, fair enough, and life is hard in general. And they don't realize the upside of the American system. Like, our society is pretty amazing, and there's so much peace and prosperity. It's ridiculous. I mean, even when we had all the protests across the country a couple of years ago, burning down cities, it's still a relatively peaceful and prosperous country, even destroying all that wealth and all that upset. It's amazing how well the American political system has held up, even though I think there are a lot of corruptions in the structure. And so there's that aspect to it too. And now you get into, Grover Cleveland did some speeches, and there's a book, I mean, it's a tiny book, it's definitely worth reading, called Good Citizenship. And as like an essay is essentially how it's laid out, even though it's based on a speech. And in there he points out, and I like Grover Cleveland, he was known for fighting corruption. He did 2 terms, but separate from each other, only president to do that. And he fought corruption in both parties and in how the businesses were corrupting the government as well. He's a Democrat. And I didn't like his treatment necessarily of Frederick Douglass, but very hard position at the time, and how would you treat that situation is difficult, right? And this is what thinking really is thinking these ideas through, this point on this side, this point on this side. And so you have to hold the concept in the state of uncertainty while you actually think about it, which is rarely done. Usually people take a point, and then the thinking that they do is actually on the reasons to support the point that they've already taken by not thinking, which is a very interesting process. So there's thinking happening, but not at the right level. They're not actually thinking about the topic that they should be thinking about. They've already made the decision there. Then they're thinking about reasons to support the position they already took without thinking. But nevertheless, this idea in Good Citizenship that he covers, that not everyone has to be a politician in a society. Everyone can't, and that doesn't even make sense. It wouldn't work great. And pure democracies where everything is voted on by everyone fall apart horribly. They're very unstable. We see that in ancient Athens, and which is why the United States is not set up like that. And also dictatorships are the smoothest operating systems, and so they're not clunky, which is what frustrates everyone with our system as well. And those also go horrible. In those systems, they can work kind of for a little period of time, but the Founding Fathers' genius was the structure that they made, that they really pulled from the English in the 1600s when it came about there. And there were definite adaptations at that period in history that were not ideal, and there's issues with that. But that the more complex structure, where you have these foundational rights, you have these different levels that check each other, you have this separation of powers into these checks and balances between the different levels and between groups, like the parties, the bicameral legislator. Thomas Paine didn't even propose the idea of a bicameral legislator in Common Sense, very famous book, in the Revolutionary War. And it was this unique thing, though. The bicameral legislator was great that the Founding Fathers came up with that to check things there, because the legislature is so powerful. Like, there's so much good stuff in there, but there's also this not good stuff, and there's also all of these things to debate. And so this idea in Good Citizenship that Cleveland covers is of civic duty. Right? You have to know enough to be able to intelligently talk about something, to debate it. Otherwise, you can't have deliberative democracy. And then some people serve as well in these roles in the elected positions. Right? They serve the function of rulers a little bit, but they have so many checks on them. That's the important part, that they can't really be that top-down ruler, because that's not what we want in the American system. And they're not exactly pure public servants either. It's not like everyone is voting on which decisions that the representatives are making, which is why representative is a good term. They're representing the interests of the society. And when the society is split, but the ideas are fairly close together, then that works pretty good, pretty smooth. People mostly agree. They say, I disagree with that, but that's okay. As the society splits more, and this is purposely done by various interests, and we see that in the pharmaceutical industry, huge now. We see that in the military-industrial complex, been talked about for a long time, by a lot of people that people should be listening to a lot more. And we see that in the government itself to a huge extent, that they divide people, this aspect of division, and then they distract people, right? They say, look over here, and then something is done over here that no one notices. And these types of games are always occurring. They always have occurred. They occurred in politics during the Founding Fathers. They occurred in politics before the Founding Fathers. They will occur in politics 1,000 years from now. And so you don't take the role to just fulfill that technical function. The technical function has to be fulfilled. And the idea of making the career move to politics, I don't think is good. And if we would have gone in a different direction of having significantly lower pay, or that being common in politics, or having no pay, the system would have developed in a different way as well. And we see those developments happening a ton. That's zoning, right? It's the 1920s. Those were really being worked out in the court battles, declared unconstitutional in the Circuit Court, Northern District of Ohio in 1924, between the Village of Euclid and the Ambler Realty Company. And then that was ruled as constitutional in the 1926 Supreme Court case, when it was appealed by a 6-3 split vote. And so that has this immense impact on the way the entire society has developed over the last century, over the last 100 years. And so you can't just walk it back to that step, and you can't jump back. You have to move forward in some aspect, but it's going to be complex in some ways, and it's going to be clunky because it has to be worked through the system. And we have the same thing on pay. Proposing that the elected officials didn't get a pay raise, I didn't expect to necessarily be too controversial, but we have enough bad actors in the community that are looking for something to be upset about, that are trying to attack any weakness, that I expect some sort of blowback on any move, any decision that I make. It's just going to be there. Right? We have almost 10,000 people in the township, 9,400, and 1,300 of those are in the Village of Lakewood Club, and so the township makes some rules for those. There's some governing, and then the council of the village does some stuff separately as well, and so those have to interact to a certain extent well, but also be separated, and that seems to go fine. And so there's a lot of debate to be had there, and I'll be interested in what people bring to that debate next year when we go through this, and what the situation is at that time. And at $43,000 a year for the three main positions, the executive committee, a lot of times it's called, of the supervisor, the clerk, and the treasurer, that doesn't exclude someone in this area from taking that job purely for pay. Now, they might have to see it as a civic duty, but if you're raising the pay, right, if we're paying me $106,000 a year, and someone is just taking it for the pay, like a mercenary type setup, and they're not so much of a missionary, right? What we really want in the type of work is somewhat of that, the missionary motivation behind that, instead of the mercenary motivation. And so if you're just taking it for the pay in those ways, then you're not really serving that civic duty that should be part of taking the role. It should be part of that, the duty and the responsibility that comes with balancing out freedom, right? With as much freedom as we can handle, we have to take as much responsibility as we can handle, because the two move together. They balance each other out. And so if you lose one, you lose the other. That is the way that it works. And it's important to keep those balanced and moving forward, and to keep that concept in there. And can the systems be designed and made better? Yes, that's part of what I'm working on in the limited sphere that I can work at this level of trying to sort out these problems. And there are definite limitations to that, But to remove all of those limitations ends up bad as well, because then you're at the arbitrariness of whoever happens to be in power at that time, and having those limitations on that arbitrary movement, I would say, is the foundation of the American idea, and even the idea of civilization itself is this idea of having due process, of having systems, of having rights. And so I think those are important. And I was interested in what would be thrown out at the meeting. I knew there would be something, some version of an attack, some version of a pushback. I expect that at every meeting and everything that comes up, and every post I make everywhere. And so this idea that I should be making more money, and that the board and the elected positions, the elected officials should be making more money, I found curious last year, and when it went through, and I was surprised about it then. And then I also found it curious this year, but I wasn't as surprised about it, of course. But I do consider those unique and interesting arguments, and I think you see that as it's an indication of the changing in the American idea, and possibly even in the concept being lost. I understand the debates on the other side, and I think I can make them stronger than the people that we usually hear make those and take those positions. But I think the strongest one is this idea of having no pay at all, which would exclude the lower socioeconomic classes. But at these positions at $43,000 a year are not excluding the lower socioeconomic class, right? I am poor. I am the lower socioeconomic class, and I have the position, and so I think that is an obvious refutation of that. And people can make other arguments that they have more financial burdens on them and this type of thing, and I'm sure they will to try to balance that out or to refute me. But I think the argument doesn't stand on as strong a base as limiting and being fiscally responsible in that way. I am interested in the debate continuing, though, and I'm sure that it will. And curious things come up. I think there are more important things to talk about and work on, definitely. And this is an example of one of these things that has to be gone through, and so the debate comes up. But are we really focusing on what's important? I mean, I think what's important is some of the things we're looking at in farming for zoning and our enforcement process and these types of things. These are some of the things that ran on. We're recording and posting videos. We're much more transparent at this point. And I think those are a lot of the important things. And then these debates over other things end up being distractions from that, which humans naturally come across. And then some people also promote as a purposeful distraction, which I don't particularly like. And so you have all those forces at play. But for now, the way that this came out in the end after all of that was that the resolutions went through, and so the supervisor, clerk, and treasurer at $43,000 a year, and that's rounding off, right? It's rounding down slightly because the actual number is $43,599.63, and then the trustees are established at $5,000 for the year, and that's where they'll be over the next year, and then we'll see how the debate goes in the next annual meeting. And so I covered some of that about the annual meeting and included in this packet the opinion from the lawyer on the annual meeting about this idea of limiting the salaries of the positions as the annual meeting's purpose for the electors voting, which I think is good. So any other questions, any thoughts, ideas, comments, criticisms, whatever it may be, feel free to let me know.